Swing it on over to our guest. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks a lot, Sean, and thanks everyone for tuning in. It's really wonderful to be here. I have a very soft spot for the SSA, so it's especially fun for me to be talking to you today. My name is Anjan Chakravartty. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Miami. Um, I started out once upon a time in Canada. That's where I was born and grew up and started my career. I studied in terms of my graduate work and my PhD in England, and then I came back to Toronto for a while. We moved to Chicago. I was at the University of Notre Dame for a while, and then ultimately working our way south to stay warm, we ended up in Miami, and we're very happy here at the University of Miami. So, uh, I'm guessing that you're here because you have an interest in secularism. Fantastic. And as you know, because I suspect you've thought about it, perhaps a lot even, secularism is all about separating the state from religious institutions. Something is secular if it isn't based on any particular religious or spiritual foundation. But of course, that doesn't mean that people who value secularism don't have any beliefs of their own, right? In fact, the very idea of secularism often goes hand in hand with the idea of humanism, which I'll say more about in just a moment. As it turns out, I'm a philosopher of science, right? I spend my days thinking about the nature of scientific knowledge. And as it happens, the modern sciences are also thought of as being secular. And that's no accident because the modern sciences are also deeply connected to the idea of humanism. So, what I want to do today is to tell you a little bit about that connection. And what I'd love for you to do is to make a note, as Sean said, of any questions that you may have along the way. Just drop them there in the Q&A box, or just ponder them until you're ready to do that. Even if it's closer to the end, I'm going to leave lots of time for questions and discussion toward the end because I think that's really important. So, thanks again for joining me. My title is Science in a Secular Humanist Society. All right. In fact, I'm so excited about this topic that some friends of mine and I wrote a book about it, and it just came out. It's called Science and Humanism: Knowledge, Values, and the Common Good. This is the cover. Uh, Best of all, it's free. Well, I mean, if you really want to, you can spend a lot of money buying a physical copy of it if you really like. But it's also available open access, which means that anyone can download it for free, right? So if any of what we discussed today is something you'd like to learn more about, then just search for the title and my name, or go to the Cambridge University Press website and help yourself. It's all yours. So here's what it's about. Don't worry about reading all of the chapter titles. I just put that down because that's the whole table of contents. But let me just mention that, as you can see, it's divided into three parts, parts one, two, and three. The first part, interrelations, is all about scientific knowledge and other kinds of knowledge, like, for example, moral knowledge, and how these things relate to each other. I'm going to talk about this a little in just a moment. Part two, inspirations, looks at the views of people who thought a lot about these things, especially this past century. And I'll say a little bit about that too. And finally, the last part of the book, part three, interventions, is about how we might try to make the world a better place by using our best science to improve our lives, right? So I'll wrap up with a few thoughts about that too before we get to your questions. So that's basically an outline of the book. So here's an official menu for today, right? So first I'm going to say something about how what counts as science and what counts as humanism have co-evolved throughout our intellectual history all the way to the present. And then in section two, I'm going to transform this background into what I take to be a huge question for today. Namely, how should we think about that relationship between science and humanism now? In section three, I'm just going to mention some important worries about this relationship, which turn on the idea that humanist values, some people maintain, have actually been bad for human well-being, right? And I'll conclude with some thoughts about why, on reflection, I don't think we should agree with that. All right, so that's the plan for today. So, section one. Some of you may know that the term science wasn't really used in the way that we use it today until the 18th century, so pretty late. The term scientist wasn't actually coined until the 19th century, so even later. But I'm going to use the term science in the way that I think we commonly use it when we talk about science. We talk about ancient science, we talk about medieval times and the sciences of, uh, of those years. That's something we often do when we talk about traditions of inquiry or investigating the world that were the ancestors to what we now think of as modern science. So I'm just going to use the term science to talk about all of that. All right. So far, so good. But what is humanism? Well, traditions of humanistic thought existed not only in Europe, but also in China, in India, going all the way back to antiquity, and also in connection with the Islamicate world of science in the medieval period. But for more sort of recent influences on the modern sciences, I'm going to start with the Renaissance. So Renaissance intellectual culture was actually largely focused on the humanities, or what we call the humanities initially. The term humanism wasn't actually in use, but the Italian word umanista was used to describe people who studied the languages, the texts, the cultures, and the thinking of the classical, the ancient world, much of which had been lost or ignored previously. Um, and they did this in terms of the fields that we now associate with the humanities. This was helped along by a rediscovery of Latin texts, right? People seeking them out, literally hunting through the libraries of Europe to find them. And then an influx of Greek scholars and Greek texts into Italy after the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople. Right? Scholars took all of their treasured texts and brought them to Italy. All of this produced an interest in the Roman idea of humanitas, or I guess it roughly translates as something like an esteem for humanity. And all of this, as well as Greek philosophy, which also came into play, had a massive influence generally, right? So, for example, as we know, in art and architecture, and it sowed the seeds of what then became various connections of science and humanism. So here's the first of these connections, right? The rediscovery of and engagement with ancient texts focused on values that scholars found expressed in these texts. And perhaps most inspiringly, what they found was a deep respect for human dignity, exemplified in capacities for self-expression and for inquiry, fueled by the application of reason. This increasingly placed humans, right, not supernatural forces or God or gods or revelation, at the center of an understanding of how we learn about and interact with the world. There were also more concrete and fascinating consequences for particular sciences during this period. So, for example, humanists during this time translated ancient texts that showed that some ancients had actually thought about the idea of heliocentrism. That's the idea that the sun is the center of our galaxy. Then they would have said of the universe, right? And that we are revolving around the sun, as opposed to the idea, right, that was common at that time, that we are the center of the universe, right? The Earth is the center of the universe, and the sun and the moon and the stars and planets are all revolving around us. So the fact that these ancients, some of them were thinking about heliocentrism, right, inspired Copernicus, right, during the Renaissance, who bolstered this idea with his own observations. So there were lots of interesting connections to the sciences of the day. But in the interest of time, let me move on now to another connection between Science and Humanism. The most important connection for my purposes today is an amazing feature of how science during this period was wrapped up with humanistic values. So earlier in the 5th century BCE, the philosophers known as the Sophists and Socrates, who you will know if you've read any philosophy, had introduced a special focus on topics concerned with social, political, and moral questions. So it's hardly surprising that with a Renaissance rediscovery of this focus on human concerns, coinciding with the substantial development of the sciences, what we find here is an understanding of the sciences that's actually focused on human concerns. And this took two closely related forms, right? So first of all, there's an understanding that rational inquiry in the form of science can serve as a means to enhancing human welfare. But in addition to this, there's the idea that the rational inquiry that we might engage in, right, in the form of science, should enhance human welfare. In other words, it's not only that we should look to scientific knowledge as a means for making the world a better place. We should actually think of science itself as directed toward the aim of making the world a better place. So as the philosopher Anthony Grafton put it, Renaissance humanists, and now I'm quoting him, had a substantial hand in the development of the notion, widely held by the 17th century, that science has profound social impact and responsibility. It's that responsibility part that I want to emphasize here. For example, when we teach the history of philosophy of science, we all often mention Francis Bacon, right, who's a hero of that history. He had very influential things to say about scientific methods, right? This was in the 16th, 17th century. But in his famous book, the Novum Organum, Bacon is fixated on the idea that the proper goal of natural philosophy, that's the sort of ancestor of the modern sciences, the proper goal of it is the benefit of humanity. This is a value claim about what we should think science is for. And I'm quoting him here, the true and legitimate goal of the sciences, he says, is to provide knowledge and resources with which to improve the human condition. So hold on to that thought. I'm going to come back to it. So let me move on now to the relationship between science and humanism during the Enlightenment, right? The period following the Renaissance in Europe. A time when, as the philosopher Constantin Kalenda put it, the humanist mode of thinking deepened and widened. I think that's a good description of humanist understandings of science more specifically. They deepened in terms of people advocating in more detailed ways for thinking about the world more empirically and scientifically at the expense of merely accepting religious dogma. It was during this time that famous natural philosophers like Copernicus and Galileo and Bacon and Newton put a lot of emphasis on reason and scientific methods for how to investigate and think about the world. But the humanist understanding of science also widened dramatically with respect to values, which gave us more explicit views of what the aim of science is. So let me focus on this last part now, the part about values. The Enlightenment is often presented in terms of an exploration of certain values or ideals, right? Including human dignity, equality, rights, freedom and democracy, being more cosmopolitan, right? Being more tolerant, social and political reform in the service of all of those values, and, of course, a growing secularism. Many of the huge number of works discussing those ideals that actually arose during this period later became hugely influential in social and political theory. And some of this amounts to what we might think of as the origins of sociology and economics. And in the background of all of this, there were commitments to ways of thinking about the world using reason, evidence, and critical thinking, and even the goal of educating the whole of society. So David Cooper describes this in terms of a vision of humanity in which we have the potential to be, he says, rational adjudicators of truth and value. The scientific image, he says, is the paradigmatic expression of humanism. So the basic idea is just that the sciences were conceived as being central to making progress on the many values that were championed in the Enlightenment, and that is what science is for. So, with all of that history, right, in the background, here's my summary of humanism as it's often described today, right? You get lots of various kinds of descriptions of humanism, but this is emphasizing some of the points that I want to draw out. What I put on this slide is sort of a synthesis of the core ideas that I want to bring forward. Humanism is a worldview emphasizing reason and science as a basis for understanding the world and our place in it, and for making it a better place. And here are its most important features. So first, it takes what we might call a naturalistic approach to thinking about what there is in the world and how we can learn and know things about it. How and what we learn here depends on the effectiveness of our own investigations into and reasoning about it, right? It doesn't depend on supernatural revelations or what have you. And second, it has an explicitly ethical agenda, right? A commitment to various forms of individual, social, and planetary well-being, including, for example, greater and better distributed freedoms, happiness, and well-being, as well as goods such as democracy and civil liberties and higher standards of living and so on. All of this through social and political institutions that can bring about the social implementation of all of those goods. And with that, let me now come right up to the present. So earlier, I talked a little bit about how some in the past were interested in the idea or the question of what science is for exactly. But now I want to suggest that this is a question we should be asking again, here in the present. Sadly, I think, this isn't a question that we've asked very much in the recent past. If you ask people what science is for these days, you'll mostly get answers like, well, it's for producing knowledge, it's for predicting things, maybe for explaining things. And of course, all of that's true. But what I want to suggest to you is that all of this, predicting and explaining and making knowledge, all of this focus on only that is a huge and ultimately sad departure from the way the aim of science was often understood historically in terms of humanism. The question of the ultimate or foundational aim of science was often, previously, thought to be one that requires that we think about our values. Thankfully, in recent decades, some important history and philosophy of science has reminded us of these kinds of views. So let me just mention the tip of some icebergs here. One of the most important movements in philosophy in the 20th century was something called logical empiricism. Don't worry, you'll be very happy to hear that I'm not going to give you a lecture on logical empiricism, what all the logical empiricists believed. If you're interested, of course, you can find that in the book. But let me just mention that they were deeply committed to the idea of making social, political, and economic reforms in line with what one of their members, Rudolf Carnap, called scientific humanism. In their big manifesto, which they called the scientific conception of the world, they said this explicitly, right? So this is the quotation from Otto Neurath and company on the slide, right? So let me read it. They say that endeavors toward a new organization of economic and social relations, toward the unification of mankind, toward a reform of school and education, all show an inner link with the scientific world conception. And as you will know, if you ever read the very stirring last lines of that manifesto, they end it by saying, the scientific world conception serves life. And here's how their member, Herbert Feigl, later summarized the ambition of the logical empiricists. This is also on the slide. He said, all of these trends of thought converge in a broad movement that one may well be tempted to regard as the 20th century sequel to the Enlightenment. And similar ideas were also central to another big movement in philosophy this past century, in the US especially. This was called American pragmatism. Uh, and these thoughts connect nicely with the logical empiricists that I just described, especially in the words of one of their members, John Dewey. Dewey was fixated on the idea that the sciences have evolved over time into tools of almost unimaginable power. And he posed the question, what are we going to do with this hugely powerful thing that we've created? Well, as you'll see in the first quotation on the slide, he said science has to face up to its social responsibilities, right? Some of these responsibilities have arisen in part because of the impact of science itself. And we should do this, as he says in the second quotation, by adopting a Baconian, right? That's the Bacon that I was speaking of earlier, a Baconian ideal. We should do this via the planned control of discovery and invention. And here's the last quotation, which I really like. He says, the great scientific revolution is still to come. It will ensue when men collectively and cooperatively organize their knowledge for application to achieve and make secure social values. Now, all of this is very inspiring, but it's been 3/4 of a century since all of these inspiring words were said about how the aim of science should be understood in terms of our values and how we can achieve those values. So the question I'd love for you to think about now is, what if we resurrected the humanist understanding of science today? If we did, what would we have to do, right? What issues would we have to confront to make it so? Well, here are a few suggestions. One of the most common worries about the humanist picture I've sketched today stems from concerns about what people call scientism. Scientism is an excessive, sort of out of control deference to the claims of institutional science. Sometimes this takes the form of overreaching claims of authority, right? Just ceding all of the authority for all our decisions to institutional science, regarding its truth or how certain it is or how confident we should be. This sometimes gets us into trouble, like during the pandemic, when at the early days, we really weren't sure what was going on, and it took a while for us to catch up. And so, we need to see things in perspective, not to be excessively or overly differential, but we need to, put things in perspective when deciding exactly how we should act on the basis of our best science. Sometimes scientism takes the form of overreaching claims of jurisdiction. So jurisdiction with respect to non or not wholly scientific domains of inquiry. For example, possibly the domain of our values, right? What should we value? What should we prioritize for science to do? Or, for example, domains where science actually overlaps with areas of traditional and indigenous expertise. I mean, sometimes the local farmers who've been working on that land for generations just know better. I think these concerns about scientism are totally appropriate here. But I also think that there isn't anything about a humanist understanding of science that requires scientism, that is, that requires getting it all out of proportion. In part because I don't think that institutional science exhausts all of what we mean by reason. Remember, humanism puts a lot of store in reason and science. I can say more about this later if you like, but let me now just throw at least one more issue on the table. This one came up earlier when I mentioned Dewey's idea of planned control of discovery and invention. Famously, a guy called Vannevar Bush, who was the director of the US Office of Scientific Research and Development during World War II, he argued that if scientists were just given complete freedom and supported, given whatever they want, they would do what they do, and this would result in huge benefits to society. Now, that vision was extremely influential then, right, mid-20th century. But today, I think it's generally viewed as being kind of naive, right? Especially given the fact that more and more science is done these days by private corporations, and they have agendas of their own. And also because the harmful consequences that some research has had on certain parts of society, or could reasonably be expected to have for certain marginalized people, like women, or those having certain sexual orientations or identities, or racialized groups, and so on. So I think there are important and open questions here about how we might actually achieve a humanist conception of science. That is, for example, should we mandate certain directions of research to benefit society, or should we not do that? If we did want to do that, how would we do it? Would that overly restrict the freedom of scientists? But then, on reflection, what professions have complete freedom? There's so much more to say here, and more issues and questions that I think we would need to tackle. But if we want to take a humanist understanding of science seriously, we're going to have to think about all of them. And part of the idea of the book is to explore a number of these questions. But with an eye on the clock, let me turn to my last section now. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about the link between science and humanism during and after the Enlightenment isn't even about scientific methods of investigation or how the sciences produce knowledge, but instead it's about social and political values. It's important to recognize that critics of humanism, and there are critics of humanism, some have argued that Enlightenment values are not all humanists think they are, right? In fact, they've been responsible, they claim, for attitudes and policies and science that, as it happens, have had terrible and unethical consequences. So, for example, some people argue that the sciences have actually promoted the degradation of life and the degradation of the planet, not improvements in human well-being and more general well-being. Now, obviously, this is a serious concern to anyone who, like me, suggests the reasonableness of a humanist story, according to which, over a long period of our history, the sciences were, and perhaps could be again, an aspirational way to promote ethical consequences instead. So, in wrapping up, let me say a few words about these important concerns. I think these worries can be collected into three overlapping categories of possible harms. So first, there are what we might call harms to people, caused by appeals to particular conceptions, right, particular ideas of reason and rationality that can result in human suffering. How? Well, in some cases, they may produce prejudice or discrimination. They've been implicated in colonialism and imperialism. So, for example, think of women and, say, people from other cultures, right, who at various stages of our history have been described as irrational or less sophisticated in terms of their reason, and for which this was used as an excuse to persecute those people. The second possible realm of harms are what I'm calling here harms to other life, which is caused by being so preoccupied with human reason and rationality that we then promote only human welfare and human flourishing. And as a result, we end up having a disregard for, or in some cases, engaging in cruelty toward other forms of life. And the third category that I have here is harm to the environment, which may be caused by being so preoccupied with human welfare that we then have a disregard for, or worse, perhaps we engage in a destructive exploitation of the environment and our planet more generally. Now, the specific details of how these concerns are spelled out by various critics of humanism vary quite a lot. But I think what I've just outlined represents a pretty exhaustive summary of the concerns that some people have about humanism. And in cases where the sciences are taken to be complicit in those harms, right? The sciences are like the means by which some of those harms were carried out, then they're also, likewise, in the crosshairs. On the one hand, I think that some of these worries are arguably not serious. I think that some of them are misleading. I think that some of them are confused. For example, some attack views that aren't correctly described as humanistic, or views that aren't actually defended by anyone who would call themselves a humanist. So that seems problematic. Some of these criticisms make astounding claims of connections between, say, the emergence of Enlightenment values and then historical catastrophes that happened after that period. On the other hand, some of these worries are surely very serious and they demand attention. So you'll find some of this in the book, but let me end here with just a couple of points in support of what I've called a humanist understanding of science. So the first has to do with the nature of values. Human values, like all values, have what I call a dual nature. In one sense, they're very abstract. I mean, things like dignity, equality, reason, and so on are abstract ideals. And as ideals, they clearly resonate with us as being positive things to seek, right? We think of them as goods. But in order to act on these things, right, in practice, abstract ideals have to be spelled out and operationalized in practice. We have to translate abstract principles into concrete policies and actions. And that's inevitably shaped by the particular historical and cultural contexts in which those translations actually happen. And this sometimes yields attitudes and practices that, from later, other perspectives seem terribly confused and sometimes just appalling. For example, ideals of equality and rights and freedoms that exclude Indigenous people or otherwise racialized people or women or some sexual orientations and identities. Ideas of toleration that exclude people belonging to certain linguistic or sectarian or social or cultural groups, etc. The very ideas of reason and rationality at various times and places have been conceived in ways that have fueled discrimination and exclusion and incarceration and conquest and slavery. But somehow the abstract ideals persist, and they're concrete manifestations are susceptible to. In fact, they require us to make them susceptible to reform and reformulation. Which brings me to the last point that I really want to make. At the start of today, I suggested that humanist traditions of thought and scientific traditions of inquiry co-evolved, and that increasingly over time, we might think of humanism as incorporating an emphasis on reason and science as a basis for understanding the world and our place in it, and for making it a better place. Part of this appeared in the form of an increasingly naturalistic approach to thinking about the world, so that how and what we learn about it depends entirely on the effectiveness of our own investigations and reasoning. And key to all of this is an openness to critical scrutiny, right? So humans, unlike gods, are limited. Our efforts to learn about the world are subject to regular and sometimes horrible failures. And to meet this challenge, the sciences are driven by a relentless pursuit of more and more effective methods of investigation. And this means that the sciences inevitably contain the seeds of their own destruction, but they also contain the seeds of their own growth and improvement. And exactly the same relentless critical scrutiny that applies to the use of science and reason in humanism also applies to our thinking about values. Values are things that have to be subjected to relentless critical scrutiny and reformulation as well. At least that's a commitment that everyone would have, I think, if they had a humanist understanding of science. All right, that's it for me for now. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. So we got a few questions here. I'll go ahead and prompt everyone to drop some questions into the chat box. Now's the time. Looks like we've got about 10 or 15 minutes here. So I'm going to just start reading some of these questions out. If you are at the origin of some of these questions and you feel like you have a follow-up as we answer them, please go ahead and drop that follow-up question in the chat box as well. I'll see your name and make sure we address your follow-up as well. So have a first anonymous question. Does science have to be for a given end, or can science be an end in itself?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think that most people today, and even historically, would describe a lot of what the sciences do as producing knowledge for its own sake, right? So that's to think of it as having a sort of an end in itself. Um, that was a tradition of thinking about theoretical knowledge that goes right back to, Plato and Socrates in ancient Greece. Certainly Aristotle regarded the highest form of knowledge as knowledge that we just have for its own sake. And that was part of the job of the sciences, was to think about these most basic questions. So you might think that, scientific knowledge is an end in itself. But I think that, to be honest, is a little bit misleading the way some of these ancient philosophers put it. Because if you think about it carefully, um, we don't just value knowledge, I mean, for its own sake. Even the expression is kind of odd, right? I mean, knowledge doesn't have sakes, right? We have sakes. So there's certain kinds of knowledge that we value, and there's certain kinds of knowledge that we don't value, right? If you just want knowledge, you could memorize the telephone book. There's a lot of knowledge in there, right? You could just memorize where everybody lives and what their phone number is. I guess there aren't telephone books anymore. You could find an online telephone book, right? There are lots of things that we could know, but we don't take it to be interesting or useful or important. We don't take it to be knowledge that would help us to understand our place in the world or to give us tools that would help us to live better or help us to do things that we want to do. So when you start to think about scientific knowledge, I think even things that seem very theoretical, they don't seem to be necessarily applied to anything that we can imagine applying them to now. Um, Even those very basic kinds of scientific knowledge fulfill some kind of need in us to know. We're curious. We want to know. It makes a difference to us. And so that suggests to me that there really is no such thing as knowledge for its own sake, right? It's precisely because there's some kinds of knowledge that we find very fulfilling, and we spend a lot of our time and energy in the sciences creating that knowledge that makes it important. So I think that all knowledge production has an end other than merely knowledge for its own sake.
Great. We have a question from Dustin. What do you think? This is a big question here. Well, what do you think most draws people towards non-humanistic ways of understanding our world, or even makes some resentful of scientific inquiry?
Mhm. Yeah, that is a big question in part because I think there's so many answers to that question, and they're all really interesting and fascinating answers. One very general thing that you might say about non-humanistic ways of understanding the world or non-scientific ways of understanding the world is that people are often, and perhaps generally, perhaps almost always, acculturated into ways of knowing the world, right? They learn about um, different ways of approaching and understanding the world as children, and that deepens throughout their education and it carries on throughout the rest of their lives. And not all of those ways of knowing or learning or just possible ways of knowing and learning if we don't think that they're actually very good at generating knowledge after all, right? If you learn astrology as a child and you take it to heart and it becomes entrenched, right, in your mind as like the way you should learn about the world, you're going to be disappointed because astrology isn't going to give you very accurate predictions about how to live in the world, at least not anything concrete. So, a lot of this is just acculturation. I think people learn things. They learn them from uh, people that are in positions of authority. They learn things from people they respect as children and as they grow up, right? They learn things that are important commitments made by or that become sort of membership criteria in groups that they belong to. And so to belong to that group, they feel they have to hold these, views and adopt certain perspectives. Um, I think that, that can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. It can be a good thing when the ways of understanding the world are actually systematic in just the way that the sciences are. So, I think one thing that we have learned in this amazing journey from, antiquity to the present through lots of different forms of inquiry that had different names, but that we now call science, is that there's something especially and amazingly powerful about a systematic empirical investigation of the world that is interacting with the world systematically through experiments, through observations, through different kinds of studies that we can do um, to generate knowledge. It is, in fact, unrivaled. Um, but what's interesting about it is that not all of that kind of systematic inquiry is limited to the sciences. So earlier I made a comment about, farmers who have lived in a particular area for generations. They've also made very systematic observations of what kinds of crops will grow well in their climate and what to expect from certain kinds of climatic conditions and their own local soil conditions and so on and so forth, right? So systematic investigation can take place beyond the sciences, um, but it's certainly a hallmark of the sciences. And I think wherever that's present, um, even if it's non-scientific, in terms of institutions, it may be scientific in terms of a good way to try to learn about and understand the world.
Great, thank you. Got some more time, folks. Certainly not going to pressure anybody. I see amazing thank you from Dustin. So not necessarily a follow-up question, but a thank you. Love that. I'm curious, just, I think one of the elephants in the room right now in society is the AI, right? Obviously. Um, and there's a lot of debate, about the direction, um, and the potential outcomes. Um, so, I suppose I would, ask, do you consider AI to be a path towards further enlightenment? And how do you feel about information, data, discoveries that come at the hands of AI?
Yeah. Um, Yeah, that is a it's not even an elephant in the room anymore. It's like a herd of elephants like everywhere, all around us. I mean, it's just a um it's an amazingly profound existential, I think, issue for us these days. I don't want to say challenge, although I think trying to understand its implications is a huge challenge. But I don't mean challenge in a bad way because I think the work to which we put AI and as it grows increasingly sophisticated is something that I think really has to be negotiated. Um, and we could, who knows, right? This is fortune telling. I don't know what the future holds for us, but we could end up using it, I think, in some constrained and careful ways that really benefit us, because there's no question that the kinds of, you know, data manipulation, machine learning, right, large language algorithms, the kinds of things that we can do with AI now um, are terrifying to us because we don't really know what's under the hood or what's in the black box. We don't really know what it's doing a lot of the time, but it can generate just amazing, amazing advances in our knowledge. But I do think it comes with huge risks. So, I think philosophers and others, of course, are thinking really carefully now about what the implications are of having completely unrestrained AI, right? Is it going to be that every science fiction movie we've ever seen comes true, right? And the machines decide to destroy humanity because we're a plague on the earth? Or is it going to be less dramatic than that? And, we might be able to constrain AI in ways that really benefit the planet and benefit ourselves and other life. I think my guess is not being, a real specialist and not really having a crystal ball knowing where this is going, that it's going to be really important for us to think about how to build safeguards and constraints into AI so that it isn't misused um, in ways that are really detrimental to ourselves. And this is part of, I think, what I meant when I described one of the challenges facing a humanist conception of science is thinking about what directions we should allow, frankly, science to take. Because just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should do something. Sometimes things we can do are foreseeably things that are going to harm people. And we should, as the agents who are monitoring and deciding what kind of science should be done, should be thinking really carefully and negotiating with one another about what kinds of values should inform what kinds of science we allow. And I think nowhere is that more obviously true in thinking about what we allow in the domain of AI.
And then we have got a question from Dr. Marty Shoemaker. How do you respond to inquiries about how science, as of late, has been controlled from powerful institutions and people and not controlled by unbiased processes? I.e., capitalistic financing or the way they control science in China. Where is the correction? Is there a correction?
Yeah. Um, That ultimately is a super, super important question. It's a question of policy and governance. Um, and I have to admit, I wish I had something more concrete to say about what sort of governance and policy making machinery, right, we should implement in order to actually enact or bring about a humanist conception of science and society. It is a question that philosophers think about. There are people who um, are spend their days worrying about what the social organization of science should be and how government and stakeholders in society and individual people should feed into the process of negotiating what values should inform how we manage scientific directions of research and scientific methods of research. But the question is an excellent one because increasingly, at least in the recent past, we've been going in the opposite direction, not of careful consideration and negotiation regarding what values we think science should exemplify, but rather increasingly, as I think I mentioned at one point in the talk, science is becoming privatized. It's increasingly it's corporations that are funding science, and they're not doing so on the basis of a humanist conception of what would best serve the welfare of humanity. They're doing it on the basis of what would maximize their profits. Um, or, other forms of influence, the mention of China and other places that may be pursuing science, for geopolitical and other reasons of influence, right, falls under the same rubric. So I wish I had something to say about how, we could wave a magic wand or snap our fingers to make sure that all of the advocacy of having a humanist conception of science could be realized in the world. Um, I do think that's really important. And the last section of the book is actually, it's the part three that I called interventions, is written by people who are thinking really carefully about the responsibilities of scientists and the responsibility of society for how we manage the sciences in order to try to bring something like a more humanistic conception of science um, to bear. Um, that isn't the part of the book that I wrote. And so I have less well-formed ideas about how best to do that. But I think it's a really important question. And as I said, there are some papers in the book that address exactly that question.
Great. And I hate to do this to you, but gonna throw another AI question at you. We got two here that mention AI, so I'm gonna kind of lump them together. I think they're very similar themes. So first question is from Karen. Is AI analogous to atomic energy and its opportunity to be used for good or ill? Then a question from Dustin says, what kinds of lines do you think need to be drawn or could even be drawn to prevent destructive scientific endeavors, like the abuse of AI, without stifling the progress of new technologies?
Yeah. Um, those are both also great questions. With respect to the first question from Karen, I do think it's analogous. I do think AI is analogous to, splitting the atom and then realizing that we could harness amazing quantities of energy by doing so. Um, you know, these so-called basic science endeavors that we engage in, right, where we're just trying to produce knowledge and we're not even clear sometimes what the applications might be. Maybe we dream of certain applications, but we don't know how we'd actually go about it. In some cases, we don't even have dreams. We don't know what we might use it for, right? But it's something we're really fascinated to do. And so we do it and we learn as much as we can about it. I think often um, they end up having massive implications. Both atomic energy and AI are examples of science that has, from the get-go, um, implications that should both really excite us and terrify us. And that was, my quip about every science fiction movie that's been made in the last however many years, right? Thinking about what computers will do to the world. Really, what we were thinking about is what AI might do in the world. So I do think it's exactly analogous. And, that presents a certain kind of challenge. This really links up, I think, with Dustin's follow-up, which is to say that sometimes it's just not clear what the implications might be, what the most realistic implications of a particular science might be. Is it going to be destructive? Is it going to be something positive? Is it going to be something that we can use for good, or is it going to inevitably be something that is used for ill? Um, this often happens when there is, cutting edge science. And I think, we just have to do the best we can do. We need to pool our thinking to imagine what the possible outcomes are of developing certain technologies based on cutting edge science. In some cases, it's just easier. I can give you an example, science of cognitive sex differences, right? There's this whole literature that's been debunked again and again, investigating, what are the differences between the mental capacities of men and women, right? And other categories. What are the differences in the cognitive capacities of people of, so-called different races? And this research has been shown essentially to be garbage many times over. And yet some people persist in doing it. Well, that's an example of something that I think we could pretty definitively say uh, can only have negative consequences because it promotes stereotypes that are hugely damaging to people that belong to certain categories that may be described in certain ways in that kind of research. So in some cases it's easier, in some cases it's more difficult. Um, so that isn't to say I have a recipe for determining what are the odds. Is something going to be destructive? Is it going to be a huge boon to society? But it is something I think we need to think about very carefully.
Great. And I want to be respectful of time, but I do have one last thought here. Says an anonymous attendee. As a lawyer and a humanist, I regard morality as a social construct that is the product of the collective conscience of people in search of the general welfare. It is the product of lived experience and dialogue. The toolbox of moral deliberation are the evolved human emotions that provide the basis for human flourishing, environmental sustainability, and regard for all life. How would you evaluate this?
Um, I think that's absolutely correct. I have, I have nothing to add. I think that's absolutely true, and we can only hope that, as evolution, we know biologically is not a directed process per se, right? I mean, evolution is not something that we should think of in terms of some kind of progress towards a better state, right? It's a series of adaptive processes to particular environments. I think when it comes to cultural evolution, which is something that I think encompasses what the questioner was just talking about, the aspects of our culture that we think about in terms of ethics and morality, um, we can ideally and hopefully set the environment so as to make progress with respect to exactly the sorts of things that the questioner was mentioning. I mean, I think the idea of evolved human emotion, which ultimately, if we're going to make progress, has to be grounded in a kind of empathy for one another and for other forms of life and for the planet, right? Is something that we might hope will produce precisely the kinds of progress toward a better state that a humanist conception of science might be able to facilitate. Couldn't agree more.
Great. All right, well, we are going to go ahead and wrap up. As a reminder, you're able to visit this webinar again through our YouTube page. We'll go ahead and post it. You're welcome to stream it with your chapters, use it as a spark to conversations back on campus. And I'll be sure to send out the link as well as the link to the book. I've sent out the link to your book, Dr. Chakravartty, and I'll be sure to also send that out as a follow-up to this meeting. I know I've sent it to all the students that are here as part of our newsletter, but for folks who are from outside the organization, I'll also send a link for the purchase or open source access to the book in discussion today. So thank you so much again, Dr. Chakravartty, for being here with us all the way from Miami, and good night, everybody.
Thanks so much.